Alright then, so it's another day and I've spent most of yesterday evening and today generally digesting different reviews of Man of Steel and seeing what people think about it. But has the internet changed my mind? Right, well, before I'm going to answer that question, I just want to check on something, because I've been hearing a lot of mention that this film has an extremely low score on Rotten Tomatoes. Now, I assumed that this was perhaps because I was reading some old things, and I wondered if maybe this was before the film came out, the preview score, when the people who are way more nitpicky than I am, you know, the stay in line all night people, maybe they were the ones giving it the low rating. But I'm just going to check, because I have heard that perhaps it's still got a very low... Yeah, 56%! Man of Steel has 56%! No, that's just incorrect. No, I'm flabbergasted. All that tells us about is the way Rotten Tomatoes works. That can't be a reflection. 56%? 56%? No! Okay, so the first big problem you guys seem to have had with this film is the amount of violence in it, or specifically the kind of violence in it, which is to say, the innocent casualties. Superman allows people to die here in a way that you guys think Superman never would. When he throws Zod through a building, that's a scene that's mentioned a lot. I don't remember exactly which bit we're talking about, because he probably throws him through a few buildings in the course of this film. There is a lot of Superman on Zod on building violence, I'll give you that. But when he throws Zod through a building, anyone who was in that building is going to die, and Superman, that is not something Superman would ever allow. You know, not to mention anyone who's standing nearby and all the pieces and all the buildings collapse on them. Superman would never do that, not the Superman I know. That's a fair point, I'm going to give you that, although I don't think it warrants writing off the whole film. I mean, this film goes out of its way to present a new Superman, and it says, hey, this is the new guy, this is the Superman from this film, and so, you know, bets are off to a certain extent as to what this Superman would or wouldn't do. So any moment when you'd be tempted to say, hey, the Superman I know would never do that, that's not valid, because this isn't the Superman you know. But, yeah, I get the sentiment behind that criticism, and, you know, it does make sense. Superman is a particular thing. In pop culture, he exists for a particular reason and has a certain role, and, yeah, that would seem to stand against that. If a new Superman is going to do this kind of thing that doesn't seem in character with Superman, then they are under obligation to establish a certain amount of context. I think they did that to a certain extent. It goes back to the flashbacks. For some reason, among people who watch a lot of superhero films, the term origin story has become a bit of a dirty word. We apparently don't want to see those anymore. I'm not concerned with seeing origin stories retold. In fact, usually I find it quite interesting and exciting. Like Amazing Spider-Man was an example where it's the same story that we'd seen before, but the scenes were rearranged and each of them had a certain thing to say about the particular film this was, as opposed to, here's the story of how Spider-Man turned into Spider-Man, point by point by point. And this film does that as well, because it doesn't go through the origin story in the ordinary way, it does it in flashbacks, and each of those flashbacks tells you something about the message of the film, or the tone of the film, or whatever. And one of the things that the flashbacks in this film tell us about is, what's his name? Jonathan Kent, Pa Kent? Old Daddy Kent's idea of the greater good. This is a big theme, because there's various different versions of the greater good that are shown to us in this film. Now, his version is, okay, the human race is not ready to see a god among them. So, for the greater good, you have to keep your identity secret, no matter what the cost. Now, we've all got a number of films under our belts, haven't we, where we're presented with a philosophical idea like this, and then the rest of the film is dedicated to essentially showing us examples of that being true. So, Great Responsibility, Circle of Life, and perhaps we're kind of expecting that to be the case here, but instead it shows an example where following this idea of the greater good would cause a lot of innocent deaths, specifically a school bus full of children. And when he's presented with this, Jonathan Kent says, well, yeah, maybe if my idea is going to be airtight, maybe a certain amount of collateral deaths are necessary. And what's really good about that moment, which is a real credit to the filmmakers and to Kevin Costner's performance, is that as he says that, it doesn't make him into a villain. See, usually in loads of films, when someone says something like, you know, innocents may have to die for the greater good, that's a cast iron villain role there. That's a villain line. But no, the way that it's delivered here and framed and whatever, it makes it more of a thoughtful thing. We sort of think to ourselves, oh no, what is the acceptable collateral damage, you know, when you're working towards a particular greater good? So it isn't a perfect philosophy, but Clark grows up embracing it, which kind of goes hand in hand with the way this film portrays people generally. One of the Kents says a line that sums it up. It's something like, you know, we're not perfect, but we're doing our best. And that's what all the humans in this film are, including Clark, if, you know, to the extent that he's a human. But then we get a really visceral example of, like, what the cost of this might be, and, you know, Clark loses someone close to him, and we lose someone, you know, close to us as an audience, you know, a character that we love, because Clark is following this philosophy all the way, even though he doesn't want to, but it's a, well, I won't spoil it, but there's a reason why he has to in that moment that makes it more resonant. And then we do get the villain version of that line, essentially. Here comes Zod, who is, you know, if people have to die for the greater good, so be it. And but we understand his motivations, though. Even though he's, you know, the villain, we get what he's doing and why he's doing it. He's bred to be a soldier. He's bred to, everything he does has to be in sort of service and protection of his race, and now there's only this that he can really do in that role, assuming that it all has to happen on Earth. I confess I may have missed the detail where it explains why it has to happen there as opposed to Mars, say, or something like that. Maybe that's a plot hole. Don't know, don't care. But what it means is that we now have this example of the fact that the greater good can be different from one person to the next. And Superman, his is kind of inherited. His is somebody else's. It's Jonathan Kent's philosophy. And so he starts to get his own idea of what the greater good is. His goal changes from protect the human race by keeping myself secret to protect innocence generally. Now, the question here that stands between, you know, the film and its critics is, to what extent has Clark's mindset been able to grow away from his dad's, or Jonathan Kent? What I'm saying is, how do we know at this point with this new Superman that this idea of protecting the human race doesn't have that school bus wiggle room? That sounds a bit callous, I know, and I don't think they were going for a Superman who'd be interested in allowing, you know, casualties and calling it collateral damage. But let's put it this way. If fighting a villain would kill some people but save the human race, would Superman have that fight, given that not having the fight would certainly kill the whole human race? In this film, yes, apparently he would. And I can talk logic at you, of course, but what we've done is we've come round to a version of Superman that's prepared to kill some people to save more people, and that's Ozymandias, isn't it? And that's not good, so maybe I'm totally wrong. But I don't know, when I was watching the film, I didn't get the impression that that was what was going on. I didn't see Superman and think this is Ozymandias sacrificing some people to save others. It really, I mean, yeah, you can extrapolate that, but that's not what it felt like watching the film, did it? It didn't to me. I thought I saw loads of examples of him going out of his way to save people from being collateral damage, and so, you know, given that, presumably any cases where he doesn't succeed, he couldn't succeed. This was a terrible amount of violence being directed towards humans, and, you know, Superman did his damnedest to put himself between them and it. To me, it looked like he did a valiant job, apparently not to everyone else, though. Another criticism I've seen is that the action is so relentless in that second part of the film that essentially the impact of it dwindles down until you're bored. Maybe that must be a mindset thing. That didn't happen to me. I was carried along with it. I was very excited all the way through. It felt to me like it was the right amount of action for what was happening for these super gods fighting. I think it's because I probably said something about this in my before section, but the previous versions of Superman felt kind of empty and sanitized, you know, rather than, like in this film, as I say, he blasts into the sky. In previous films, he sort of goes, up I go, and he, you know, he moves in a way that you can move if you're on a wire and you're a human. And maybe I went along with it in that sense, that, you know, the fact that previous Superman films were a little bit more sedate was not because they, you know, that makes a better film, but because it was all they could do. It probably is deliberate. It probably was because they wanted to put more, you know, characterization and so on in it. But the fact is, this film could do out-and-out ridiculous Superman action, and it did. And I'm happy with that. There are other things it could have done. Hopefully its sequels will do those things, but this one did this. I saw someone comment that by setting it up this way, that here's the highest of stakes, here's essentially what happens when Superman is pushed to the edge and the most amount of violence comes out of him possible. It means that in future sequels, and specifically, you know, if JLA ties in with this, which I understand it is, then we'll know what's being kept bottled up. We'll know what can get, kind of like the Hulk in Avengers, you know, we know the damage he can do if he's ever angry enough. And now we know the same about Superman, which wasn't true before. I mean, in the case of the Hulk, we just culturally knew what he can do. With Superman, we kind of culturally know that he's a, well, Boy Scout, and that he'll kind of not hurt anyone and not much explosive action will come out of him. We're kind of used to a Superman that's sort of one half of a detective team, you know, the other half being Lois Lane, and they sort things out with a bit of super lifting and so on. Now, now we've got this vision of what someone that powerful could really do and how frightening that could be, and I think that's going to tie into JLA really in a very interesting way. Next criticism, product placement. A lot of people are really bothered by the amount of product placement in this film. Fair enough, I won't argue with you there. I'm not quite clever enough to have spotted it all. I saw IHOP. Not sure about the rest. Mind you, American brands are slightly different to ours, so I might not, you know, be as familiar with all of them as you are. But this is one of those gripes that, you know, a lot of people have about a lot of different films that I've never quite been able to find the energy to care about. I get what people's problem is here. I mean, it's, you know, we all know about how product placement works and that these companies have paid to get their logos into the film, but it's just more cynical than I'm prepared to be while I'm watching a film. You know, as far as I'm concerned, the world has Pepsi in it. I've got a bit of Pepsi in the fridge now. You know, if there was a film about me and I opened the fridge and there was nothing in it except for like Happy Slurper Cola or something made up, that's what would spoil my immersion, not that real brands are involved. You know, if the character then picks up the Pepsi and goes, boy, I do like drinking this Pepsi, you know, like the Wayne's World thing, then yes, then that would be a problem. But I don't think the way it's presented in this film, I don't remember it standing out. Perhaps I'll be proved wrong next time I see it. Hope is a big issue that people are talking about. There's not enough hope in this film. Probably the simplest way I've heard it put is Batman is about fear, Superman is about hope. And people are saying that, you know, there isn't enough hope in this film, the ending is extremely bleak, and because of the comparison with the Dark Knight series, you know, the hope that Superman stands for is absent here. See, I came out of the cinema talking about that, but from the opposite perspective. I thought it did have hope in it. Specifically, I'm talking about with the comparison to the Dark Knight. Whenever you see people in the Dark Knight films, they're either corrupt, or they're criminals, or they're destitute, and they've got no hope in that sense. So there's no hope for people in that film, except maybe through the actions of a few shining, beacony people, as I mentioned before. In this film, the people are the hope. That's the source of hope for me, compared to Dark Knight, and I think that's where it stands out the most. But because this film is comparing itself to Dark Knight in as many ways as it can, the advertising, but also just the form of the film itself, I think that comparison is the one they're drawing. In this film, the average Joe is decent. And I'm bringing this up again because I neglected to mention Perry White before. That might say something about the extent to which he's featured in this film, maybe. But we can all agree, can't we, that we came out of this film thinking, if I was ever in a disaster situation, I'd want Lawrence Fishburne there. Lawrence Fishburne will save your life, and if he can't, he'll wait there with you till the end. Now, I think he was there to essentially represent the equivalent of the Kents, but in a city setting. You know, because previous versions of Superman, you can be read as saying that country people good, city people bad, what with all the tycoons and barons, Lex Luthor and so on. Whereas here we have, you know, a city guy, and he is just as good. And finally the big one, the ending. If you've got this far into the video, but you've not seen the film yet, switch me off now. You know, the spoilers I've been dropping up till now have been minor, this is the big one. I'm gonna still attempt not to say it because I know some of you people are gonna continue watching, but I think you're gonna figure out what I'm talking about. So as I said before, I only recently, in the run-up to this film, sat down to watch the old Christopher Reeve films, and if you're familiar with those, then you'll know that the first one opens up with General Zod being sentenced to the Phantom Zone, as this film does. Now, because I hadn't seen them before, I didn't yet know that he was gonna be the villain in the second one. So at the end of the first film, when he hadn't come back, I was going, what? Hang on? Is that what General Zod is? I've heard of General Zod, is that it? So I wondered if maybe his fame is not from the films, but from the comics or something like that. So I looked him up, and what I found out was that General Zod is famously the first person who Superman kills. Or at least the most famous, but the way it was presented to me was it was his first murder. Superman straight up murdered someone because it was the necessary thing to do. Apparently it happens in Superman 22 in 1988. So you might want to go and Google that better than I did. You know, I Googled it, but after a certain amount of reading about DC history, my eyes just glaze over. So then I watched the film, and sure enough, Zod is the first person Superman, as far as I can remember, actively murders. But he does it in such an un-Supermanly way. He does it in a snarky way. What he does is he tricks Zod into losing all his powers. So at this point, Zod is just a normal guy, but he doesn't know. And then Superman crunches his hand up just because, I don't know, it really hurt him, and then he super throws him into this pit that's so deep you can't see the bottom of it. So if it's got a bottom, then he died. And if not, then it's bottomless, which means, yeah, he died. He's well and truly murdered this guy, and then he starts grinning and cocking an eyebrow. And then Lois goes, brilliant, I'm gonna have a go, and she murders that amazing woman You know, the one who totally stole the villain show in this film. I can never remember her name, but she was amazing. Then they just sort of stand there grinning and giggling at each other and they have a little cuddle. This film tackles that as a theme. You know, it says, right, what would it feel like for Superman if he discovered that he had to murder a supervillain because it was the only thing he could do? But he's still a really good guy and he doesn't want to murder anyone, and he hasn't murdered anyone before. In fact, up till now, he's watched people be murdered by this guy and he doesn't like it. Instead of grinning and chuckling, he's in absolute moral anguish over the very suggestion that he would have to do this. And apparently that's bad. That's not Superman. You've got Mark Waid, an influential Superman writer, practically boasting about how he ruined that scene for anyone who happened to be, you know, emotionally into it by standing up and yelling at the screen. I don't like that sort of behaviour. It reminds me of all the people who were proud that they spoiled the emotional climax of Star Trek Into Darkness for people who happen to be into that, because, well, they know enough about Star Trek to know that there was a better scene once, so they need to spoil it for everyone else, because I know more about Star Trek and you guys need to recognise that. Nerd culture, there's something wrong with it. That's a tangent, I'll do another video about that one day probably. Anyway, I saw one reviewer on YouTube that specifically seemed to think that the reason that that scene happened was because Superman was really, really worried that Zod was gonna laser eye blast these three people, this family that was in the corner. But I don't think that's right, did I didn't get that wrong, did I? I thought that it very clearly showed that they represented all innocent people from now on. You know, because Superman says, "Don't do that," and Zod's like, "I will," and Superman goes, "Please stop," and he goes, "Never." I can't remember if he says the word never specifically. I think he does, but either way, that's the implication. He's not going to stop. And here's this family representing the people he's not going to stop killing. He's not just going to kill them with a laser blast forever. He's talking about everybody. And there they are, and you know, by the way, they look a bit sort of like the Kents, you know, small family. And Superman sees them and goes, that's everyone. He's going to do this to everyone. That's his plan, that's his point, that's what he's doing. Okay, so if I missed any of the major complaints that I ought to think about, let me know in the comments and maybe I'll do another video addressing them. But for now, has the internet changed my mind about Man of Steel? No, I don't think so. Not yet, anyway. Maybe next time I see it with all of these ideas in mind, I'll consider it then, and I'll maybe see the film in a different light. But given how much of a good time I had, and given how I felt at the time, these good points all, by the way, they're all perfectly valid points. But no, I don't think they've actually changed my mind, because I think this is a film that's different to the film that those points would add up to, and that's deliberate. I think I would have to really not want to like this film anymore to allow those points to change what my opinion of it was, because it was a great experience. I mean, I haven't had so much fun in the cinema in a while. I am slightly concerned that maybe now I've got these points in mind, it'll take away from any future enjoyment that I might have when the Blu-ray comes out, for instance, because I'll be getting the Blu-ray. But, you know, I'll find out then. I hope not, because that's exactly the sort of thing I don't like about the internet, is when it can change your mind in a way that makes you less happy. But for now, I think Man of Steel is safe. I still like Man of Steel. In fact, I really want to see it again. So, for my first Change My Mind review, nope, the internet didn't change my mind. Ha ha! Take that, internet! I'm still happy.